Okay, so we're in chapter 4, verse 1 of John, and we're going to talk a little bit about the woman of Samaria. And I'd like you to know, first of all, before we start this, what Samaria is. If you were to look at a map of Israel, the northern part of Israel is called the Galilee, okay? It's not called, it's like the Ukraine. The Ukraine is not called Ukraine, it's called the Ukraine. And the northern part is called the Galilee, and then in it is the Sea of Galilee. Then you have Samaria, and the southern part is called Judea. And what happened was at one time when they were conquered by the Babylonians, one of the ways the Babylonians actually enforced their control over people was to take a group of people from somewhere and plant them in the middle of Israel. And then the people they took out of the middle of Israel, they planted in the center of another country, The only place other than that I know that does that is England. If you would watch them, you have the Irish enclave, the English enclave in Ireland called Northern Ireland. And they did that historically. But the Babylonians did it as well. So this area, Samaria, was there. Now, one of the difficulties is in the ancient world, they believed that gods were territorial. And I don't know if you remember the story of Jonah, but when Jonah the prophet is on the boat going away, trying to escape God, because God spoke to him and wanted him to go to the city, so he wasn't going to do that. So he escaped on the boat. If you remember in the book of Jonah, God's announcement to him is, I am God of the land and the sea, because they thought Neptune had the sea and, Yahweh has Israel and stuff like this. So anyway, the Samaritans then decided that they would join in the worship of Yahweh. And so they considered themselves Jews, and they followed the worship and everything very clearly. And at a certain point, the Jews who were held captive in Babylon were released, and they were free to come back to Israel to rebuild the temple. So the Samaritans got together and got a huge amount of building materials and everything, a lot actually of lumber from Lebanon, from the cedars of Lebanon. And they sent this in a caravan to Jerusalem. And when it reached Jerusalem, the authorities in Jerusalem were trying to figure out whether they could use this material from non-Jews. So they didn't consider the Samaritans Jews. And so they refused the material. And when the material came back to Samaria, what they did was build their own temple. They built their own temple, basically to Yahweh, but their own temple. And the interesting thing about it is if you're coming down from Galilee, it's in Samaria where you begin the huge climb that will take you up to Jerusalem. It was so much easier just to go to that little temple down there. So there's a lot of conflict in the societies about the whole thing. There's no bigotry like religious bigotry, trust me. So, beginning chapter 4, it says, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard he was making and baptizing more disciples than John, I'd like you to notice the next verse, though in fact, not Jesus himself, but his disciples were baptizing. Remember I told you earlier, Jesus never baptized, okay? Even though before they said he did. So he left Judea and set off to Galilee. He had to pass through Samaria. Now he did not have to pass through Samaria. What most Jews would do would be come down to the beginning of Samaria, then they would cross the Jordan River and go down what we would call the country of Jordan. They called it Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan that was outside Israel. And they would go down to the city of Jericho, where they would cross the river again, and then they'd be in Judea. And so they avoided Samaria. And Samaritans and Jews it did not mix well. I think you remember the story of the Good Samaritan. That's why it's such a phenomenal story, because none of the Jews at the time would believe that you could put the good and Samaritan in the same sentence, okay? But the Samaritans returned the favor. They didn't think you could put Jew and good in the same sentence. So, what this indicates is the speed with which Jesus was leaving Judea. For some reason, the reaction of this Pharisee and everything must have really worried Jesus for him to take the shortest route to go right through Samaria, because that was dangerous. It was a dangerous route to take. So he did it. So he came to the Samaritan town called Sychar, near the land that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all lived in that area. And so now he arrives there at this town called Sychar. And we see Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired by his journey, was sitting by the well. If you get to visit Israel, Jacob's well is very interesting. It still exists there. The well, I can't say the accoutrement around it have anything to do with Jacob, but everything in the Holy Land, one of the jokes in the Holy Land, the most important thing connected with Jesus' life for the Jews is the Sea of Galilee, because it's the only thing the Christians can't build a church on top of. So if you look at this well, there's a half-built church around it, and it was being built by the Tsar of Russia when the Russian Revolution came. Okay, so I don't know whether they're planning on finishing it or they will finish it. But anyway, the well is there. And the important thing is the well was not inside the city. The well's out for obvious reasons, at a distance. And so they would need the water, but it would be wise to avoid going in the city as a Jew. So that's what he did. And tired by his journey, he was sitting by the well. It was about noon when a Samaritan woman came to draw water. So, and oftentimes preachers will point this out, if you've ever heard a sermon about it, that it wasn't normal for a woman to draw water at noon. It's not normal in Israel to go outdoors at that time. They get up unbelievably early in the morning and work till a certain point, at which time they have what's called an Israeli breakfast, which is probably the largest meal of the day. And then they have kind of a siesta time until probably about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then they work in the evening, because the center of the day is very hot there. There's speculation that the women in the town knew about her background and they would stay away from her. But to be honest, the women normally got water in the early part of the day in the morning, and they would use it for the cooking and stuff during the day. But for the women, that was their major part of the day to meet and greet. So, I mean, they knew one another, but that's where they had their camaraderie. And so it would be very important for a woman to be there at that time. It could be possible that a woman would be there at the time, have water, and run out during the day because of something that was going on, and then you'd have to go get water, okay? But whatever, know that it's unusual for her to go there about noon. Jesus said to the woman, "Give me a drink." Okay? Now, the first thing to know is that the way it's written in English, it sounds like a command, but it isn't. Okay? It's a request. It just, so he's asking for the water. One of the things that is very interesting in the history of Jesus, if you watch in the scriptures, very often when he enters into a relationship with someone, that you see through the text, it begins with Jesus asking for something. And one of the reasons is, and I've heard this from some really interesting people, that one of the thing about this is that, like Jesus generally had the reputation of being this great rabbi or even a prophet. So he has this reputation. So it's very, very difficult for people to come into a relationship with Jesus. But if he asks for something from them, he's established the relationship. And so that if someone asks you for something and you do it, you're on an equal footing. It's a very simple thing. And so Jesus will consistently do that. I knew an abbot in, where it's very near where Coors beer is made, actually. But there's a monastery there called St. Michael's, and there's a Benedictine monastery, a very large one. But the abbot there, when I was there, I would say the abbot was in his early 40s, a pretty young abbot. But one of the things about the abbot was that he didn't have a driver's license. And I asked him about that one time when we were doing something, and he said, I don't have a driver's license so that I have a reason to ask people to drive me places. And what he would do was he would go out and say Mass at the neighboring parishes and stuff, and he would ask some young man in the thing, and you're locked in the car with them, and you're talking and stuff like this. And he said, you never asked me why I'm an abbot and so young. Well, I mean, that's not the correct question I think you would ever ask. But anyway, I didn't. And I said no, but I said it is a curiosity, because the abbot is elected. When the other abbot either retires or dies, then they elect the next abbot. And he said, the reason I got elected is that right now there are more people in the monastery that I got in through this sort of thing than there are, other people in the monastery. So he said, I've never gotten the driver's license at all, and as a regular monk, I mean, that you didn't drive and people would help you would be normal. But as an abbot, you'd normally have the driver's license, but he was never going to do that. And he got it specifically from Scripture. He was the one who told me to look at it. He says, you watch it, you'll see how often Jesus asks for something in the beginning of the relationship in order to establish the relationship, So, the disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan said to him, how is it that you, a Jew, can ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink? Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Okay? So she's shocked that he would ask for the drink. And to understand the seriousness of this Samaritan thing, one of the people in the class this morning had told me this story before, but she brought it up at the class in another context. She was on a flight from New York, and the flight from New York was going, I think, to Miami, maybe someplace like that. But once they were seated on the plane, they stopped and they reseated everyone. No matter what your thing was, they reseated everyone. And they reseated everyone because there was an Orthodox rabbi on the flight, and he was seated next to a single woman. He couldn't go. It could not fly that way. So I don't know whether they put a man next to him or a Jew or whatever it was. But anyway, they rearranged the entire plane so that this could, because these are very serious things at that level. So he's this Orthodox Jew. I would have sat a gay guy next to him, but I mean, that's just me. So anyway, Jews and Samaritans don't associate. And Jesus said to her, if you knew what God was offering and who is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. So Jesus is, first of all, saying, if you had any idea who I am, then the asking would not be the deal. It would be the response that you'd be asking me for whatever. I'd also like you to notice the reference to living water. We use that rather constantly in the scriptures, and it is a reference to moving water. Like when I was a Boy Scout, one of the things we were told is that you don't drink water unless you can see it flowing for a certain distance to drink it. You don't drink still water. And so, and still water in Hebrew is called dead water, okay? So this is called living water. And that's why Jesus will consistently refer to water with regards to life, life-giving water, living waters, and that sort of thing. And that's also why in the Roman Catholic Church, it is a requirement in baptism that the water flow. The water must run. Now, there are some denominations who will baptize by simply, sprinkling. And if you're doing it with one person, that's probably a valid baptism because it'll run. But if you have a whole group of people there could be people who aren't even hit with the water, And so, but in the Catholic Church, there are three ways of doing baptism. One is submersion like the Baptists, you go totally under. And the other extreme is pouring on the head. Pouring on the head, it came into the Catholic Church as the church began to move more into Northern Europe. And, to baptize a baby by submersion in Germany in the winter, you wouldn't have a baby, okay? So that way. But the middle way is actually the preferred way in the church. The middle way is called baptism by immersion. And baptism by immersion, you stand in the water or kneel in the water, and the water is poured over you, okay? And why is that the preferred way? If you look at all the paintings of the baptism of Jesus, the old icons, everything, he's always standing in the water, and John the Baptizer is pouring water on him. Now, obviously, there were no icon painters at the baptism of Jesus. But what that does, it tells you what was going on in the churches at that time, because that's the way they've canonized and things. So in our tradition, the preferred way is that way. And the easiest way is, pouring water on the forehead. And I think it's a interesting thing. If you were to look at the Catholic Church, the movement that you saw in liturgy up to and ending with John the 23rd was a move to expediency, okay? Like if you look historically, we stopped serving wine because that would take longer. We, distributed communion in hosts quickly. We didn't break up the bread as they used to for the whole thing. We have them already in the thing. But the thing to expediency, with John the 23rd, expediency ended. And we tried to get back more and more to the ancient liturgy, and we're still moving to that. But one of the things in the ancient liturgy was people were baptized by immersion. But there was no way to do that in our churches. You have this little fount, person would be lucky if they get 1 foot in there. But you couldn't baptize by immersion. But in the newer churches, they're all building the immersion things so that that's become the thing. And I'll tell you, with regards to babies, when I came to the mission, we, during the, the period of Lent, when we were preparing for the admission of adults, we put a hot tub in the sanctuary, and we used it for the baptism of the adults. But the interesting thing is we had another thing, actually from the old mission, a large bowl that we put hot water in. And baptizing babies, oftentimes babies cry and everything at a baptism. I've never seen that happen at a baptism by immersion, because the baby's best experience is when the parents are bathing the baby, because then the baby has your undivided attention, You don't leave the baby alone. So the babies love, as long as the water is warm, they love it. I found that baptizing babies that way, they loved it. So it was a good thing. But anyway, so this is the thing about the living water. And she answered, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. where do you get this living water? Now he's saying, I have living water. And what's she getting? She's getting still water because it's out of the well. So the idea is living water is always better for you, the flowing water. And she says, so there's nowhere around here there's flowing water. Where are you going to get flowing water if the very best I can get is out of this well? Okay? And are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well, who drank from it himself, his sons, and his cattle? Okay? If you read the stories in Genesis, one of the big problems with Jacob had herds, and there were herdsmen in the area as well. And every time Jacob would dig a well, then there was a conflict about who the well belonged to. So this well is called Jacob's well, and it's mentioned very specifically in Genesis because this is the first well that they didn't dispute. And like he always moved away from a disputed well. But this was the first one they didn't dispute. So Jacob used this well. And then Jesus answered, whoever drinks this water will be thirsty again. But anyone who drinks of the water I give will never be thirsty again. The water that I give will become an inner spring welling up to eternal life. So he says, it's not that there's a river here of flowing water, but remember, a spring is also flowing water, that it flows out of the ground in the spring. So Jesus says, the living water I offer is a spring that I will open within you. So I open the spring and you will be satisfied by that. And he mentions here, and I think in this account, this is the first mention of eternal life. Okay, he says it will spring up and to eternal life. The woman said to him, Sir, give me this water so that I never will be thirsty or go on coming here to draw water. Jesus said to her, call your husband and come back here. Okay? So he said, call your husband and come back here. And that would not be unusual in the conversation with a man and a married woman. That, that the husband should be there in the thing. So if we're going to have this conversation, get your husband. The woman answered him, saying, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you're right to say, I have no husband. You've had 5 men, and the one you now have is not your husband. You've spoken the truth. Okay? So Jesus has this insight to the woman. So he says this. She immediately tries to change the subject. Okay? And she says, the woman said to him, Sir, I see you are a prophet. Okay? Now, what does she mean by prophet? He had an insight into her that she hadn't said or anything. So she says, I can see that you're a prophet. Okay? And what she does then is immediately move into a theological question. And the theological question is, our parents worshipped on this mountain, though you say the place people should worship is in Jerusalem. So that conflict about the 2 temples. She says, then you say we're supposed to worship in Jerusalem, and we build our temple here on this mountain here. And since I have the advantage of having a prophet here with me, let's answer the question. So she presents the thing. And I think it's amazing to listen to the questions that are presented to Jesus all the way through the scriptures. Like Peter says, how many times should I forgive someone? As often as 7? Jesus jumps outside that, 70 times 7, okay? Or what are the reasons where you can actually have a divorce? Jesus says, you can't have divorce, goes on. But when you ask Jesus a question, oftentimes they'll give the perimeters of an answer, and he never answers within the perimeters. Never. He'll move out of it. So now we go on. He says, believe me, woman, The hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Now, this is a very interesting verse. Is he looking to the day when Jerusalem will be destroyed and Samaria will have been destroyed? Is that kind of what he's talking about? I'm inclined to think, and we'll see this as it goes on, he's referring to the fact that worship becomes an interior thing. It's not an external ritual. So that, like, for instance, we go to Mass on Sunday, and in the church, I'm sure God could point out who's praying and who isn't. But we're all going through the same ritual. And that's because worship is actually an internal thing now. Also, after the business of the temple in Jerusalem, we believe in our tradition that each person has an individual relationship with God. So the worship of God, the worship you render God, is something that goes on in hopefully day and night and this sort of thing. And the only thing that happens in church is we do it together. But it should be the thing that's going on in our lives when we aren't there too. Okay? It's just that I'm supposed to live in a dialogic relationship with God. And that dialogic relationship should go on. You know, it should be, everything goes wrong, anything goes wrong in my life, I should first refer to God. You know, anything is good, I should first thank God. This whole business. And there are, I always think this is interesting about the Irish. The Irish have integrated this into their language so that if anything good happens, they'll always say, thank God, and then go on with what, but it's just, you know, it's like us saying God bless when someone sneezes. It's just integrated into the language. And if they talk about anything with the future, they'll say, I'll see you tomorrow, God willing. It's always God willing. If you refer to the future, God willing, okay? So, but they've integrated these things into their language. So he says there's a time coming when this worship will not take place in either place. I should also mention, if you're interested or curious about this, if you ever visit Israel, it is possible for you to visit the Samaritan community. There's still a small community of Samaritans who are in that area, and they have very much Jewish structure of worships and prayers and everything, but they are not Jews. They are the Samaritans, okay? So they're still there. He says, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. So he says, you worship, you know, Yahweh, but you actually aren't the people to whom Yahweh spoke. You are not the people to whom Yahweh revealed himself. In fact, for you, your relationship with Yahweh is secondhand, okay? Whereas we, as the Jews, we are God's people. And we actually know God. And again, if any of you who were involved in that ecumenical meeting that took place last night, I guess it was, the you know, that Jewish Islamic Christian group, the book they're going to cover at their next meeting is a book called Man's Search for God, or Man's Seeking God, or something like that. And it's by Abraham Heschel. And it's one of the things that's going on in the book is that there is a huge difference between knowing about God and knowing God. And a good theologian of any denomination can give you a good list of about God, okay? And that's fine, that's what the study's about and everything. But the real thing of religion is to actually know God. And one of the things about God is God reveals him to different people differently. And so God will reveal himself to some people as like a problem solver. They get sick, they pray to him, they get well. They get, you know, I go through a whole list of things. God will reveal himself to another person about what you can learn about the problems. And the person will become very, mystical or whatever in dealing with very serious problems that you and I would tell God we want out of, But God chooses to relate to people in very different ways. It's always the same God, always exactly the same God. But the relationship that you have with God is a relationship that no other person has ever had or ever will have. It is absolutely unique. And that's why it's so important for us to remain in this kind of relationship with God, because I can offer God something no one else in the universe has ever offered or can ever offer. And so do you, each one of us. And to the degree that we actually deny God that, it's sad, It's like when we go to communion, like a person they accidentally break their fast or this sort of thing, and so they don't go to communion. One of the things they told us in the seminary is that people, are very, very sad that they can't go to communion because they accidentally ate a donut on the way or something like that. But what they told us in the seminary, don't think of it that way. Think of what you're denying God. If you realize it's a matter of denying God something, you realize if you accidentally ate the donut, go to communion. Don't deny God the relationship simply because you accidentally ate a donut, That this whole thing, to come to this sense of a relationship with God, and that really applies to prayer. Like when you talk to God, you pray whatever you want, but to be able to learn how God speaks to you, whether it's through people or books or whatever, meditation, but it's a dialogue only when both sides are heard. And the problem is that most people talk at God and don't really listen or find a way to hear God, that's where the dialogue is created, okay? And that's a crucial thing. Incidentally, I'd really encourage you, even if you're not in the, that ecumenical thing of the Jews, the Muslims, the Christians, if you're not involved in that at all, I'd encourage you to read Abraham Heschel's book. Abraham Heschel is, in my personal opinion, probably the strongest mystical theologian of our age. He's just tremendous. And what he says about prayer and the relationship with God definitely comes from the Jewish tradition, but you could read that from any tradition I've ever talked to. You could read it as a Buddhist, you could read it as a Hindu, you could read it as a Christian. It's a magnificent book about prayer. So, he says, the hour is coming, and now here, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such are the worshipers whom the Father seeks. Okay? So the Father wants people who are going to worship him in this individual relationship, independently of the temple on the mountain or the temple in Samaria. That, if you're a Jew, your individual relationship to God, you celebrate in the temple with the other Jews. If you're a Samaritan, your individual relationship with God, you celebrate with the other Samaritans in the Samaritan temple. If you're a Catholic, you celebrate it in the Catholic Church. But the relationship is not tied to that. The relationship is you and God, okay? And again, if you read Abraham Heschel, he said you can never stand before God alone. God speaks to you as an individual, but we always speak to God from a community. That's why when Jesus taught us the prayer, it's our Father. I can never come before God as my Father. I'm not allowed to do that. We come before God with this community thing. So, the Father seeks this, and the other thing is to worship God in truth. And what does it mean to worship God in truth? It's to be honest in your prayers. That I think there's lots of parts of our lives we're really glad most people don't know about. And there's lots of areas of our life. But to understand, that's not true of God. The fact is, he knows anyway. So in coming before God, you have the ability to actually be yourself. And understand, like if I'm involved in some horrible, sinful life, and I come before God in prayer, understand I wouldn't be there if he didn't want me. So obviously, he is not overly impressed with the misery of my moral life. And so we need to, that gives you a great sense to think, that like if you're involved in a terrible sin, and some people, carry these things for years in their hearts. And I can't tell you how often I've had someone come in who's practicing Catholic. I've been watching them in church for years. They say, I have something that I want to confess that took place when I was in high school, and I've never been able to tell anyone. You're thinking to yourself, God knew all along, what the heck, tell him, this sort of thing. But anyway, the idea of being able to stand before God in truth, it's the one place you have the ability to actually stand in complete truth, is when you stand in the presence of God. And know that God always stands before you in truth. God's not capable of standing outside truth. So God stands in truth. What does that mean? That means if God is willing to accept my prayer, irrespective of what I think of my life, it is acceptable. If he accepts it, it's acceptable. It's just that simple, It may need to be changed, a lot of things about it, all that. That's not the issue. It is indeed acceptable, okay? And I oftentimes think of it in, I told you I had a rock collection, and one of the things you do if you're interested in cutting and polishing stones, which I did too, but if you're interested in cutting and polishing stones, you can pick a stone up out of a creek, for instance, and if it's in the creek, you can see it, but if it's a dry, all you have to do is wipe saliva on it, and you can see what it will look like polished. And so you know what you have. Let's say a piece of agate. You know what you have. Now, before it's useful or anything, you're going to have to cut it, you're going to have to polish it, you have to set it, and all that sort of thing. But you have a piece of agate. And see, that's how God looks at us. I have this person. Now, this person definitely needs a lot of work. However, I've got this person. And together, we can make anything. And just somehow come into the presence of God in this way. He says, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. Okay? So, God is spirit, and I must worship in spirit. What does that mean? That means the ritual is not what's pleasing to God. It's the spirit that we carry into the ritual that is pleasing to God. Our relationship with God is this spiritual thing. It's celebrated in rituals that have been given us, and good rituals. But the ritual is not the thing. Now see, one of the things that had happened in some of the branches of Judaism, and most particularly in the Sadducees, remember, were the priestly class. Now the priestly class was meticulous with the following of all the norms of ritual. That's how they made their living. It was all done very, very clearly, and set it all up, and they knew exactly what you had to sacrifice for the birth of a child and the churching of a woman. And I mean, they knew all this stuff then, and they did it very, very meticulously. But their hearts were not in a relationship with God at all. The reason is that in order to maintain their position, they had to be compromised with the Romans. The Romans who maintained the thing. That was the privilege of the Pharisees. The Pharisees weren't compromised because they didn't have to be involved in all of that. So what he's saying is the primary thing is this worship in spirit and in truth. And it's an interesting thing. Like if you put this in your mind, when I go to, let's say, when I visited China, I would go through large areas of many, many Catholic Chinese who had no church, no building, and no clergy. And yet I baptized lots of children when I was in China because they knew I was a priest when I came in there. So I did that sort of thing. But to come to understanding that the church, the building, and the ritual is where we do publicly and communally what we're supposed to always be doing privately. And if you can't do it communally and publicly, nothing and no one can stop you from doing it privately. And that's the thing that God most wants, you know. And I think it's easier for us in a group, more enjoyable in a group, more interesting in a group. But from God's point of view, it's that worship in spirit and in truth. And to always, you know, whenever you're involved in the liturgy, to do whatever you can to have your spirit more and more involved in what's going on or how God's speaking to you or this sort of thing. And to not allow serious distractions. And by distractions, I don't mean distractions from the ceremonies. I mean distractions from this prayer relationship with God. Okay? So, the woman said to him, I know that the Messiah, the one called the Christ, is coming, and when he comes, he will declare everything. Okay? So now Jesus has told her, it doesn't matter if you worship on these two places, it matters that you worship in spirit and in truth. And she says, well, we'll wait for the Messiah, because when the Messiah comes, he'll tell us everything. Incidentally, he is, called the Christ. The word Christ means anointed. The word for oil is chrism. So the word Christ means anointed. And the Messiah is called the Anointed One, okay, in history. So when he comes, he tells us everything. Jesus says, I am he, the one who's speaking to you. So she says, when the Messiah comes, then he'll explain it. What Jesus is basically saying, I am the Messiah, and I did just explain it. Okay? So this is it, and I'm the Messiah. At this point, the disciples returned and were surprised to find Jesus speaking to a woman, but none of them asked, what do you want, or why are you talking to her? So the apostles arrive. It's not appropriate for Jesus as a rabbi to be, speaking with a woman, much less a non-Jewish woman who's there alone, okay? But the apostles don't ask him what you're doing, and they don't ask her, why are you there? And one of the reasons is, I don't know how many of you have ever seen the musical Jesus Christ Superstar. One of my favorite songs in the whole thing is when Jesus is talking to Magdalene. And Magdalene has this colorful reputation that actually comes from tradition. There's no foundation for it in the scriptures at all. But anyway, she has a colorful reputation. And so Jesus is talking to her, and the apostles come up to him, and the song they sing is, it does not help us if you're inconsistent. In other words, if you need to reject this woman if you're against adultery, this sort of thing. But one of the things that the apostles have come to do, and this is very early in this story, they now accept the inconsistency of Jesus. Everything Jesus does becomes clear over a period of time, but as it's going on, it oftentimes appears to be inconsistent or out of line or anything. And that was how the Pharisees condemned Jesus and all kinds of things. Now, does the scripture forbid, let's say, a rabbi to talk to a woman? It does not. Okay? But that's one of the interpretations that they came through. And remember, Jesus had no time for the way they interpreted this stuff. The woman left her water jar and went off to the town and said to the people, come and see a man who's told me everything that I have ever done. Could this be the Messiah? So she goes into town. Remember I told you one of the keys to John's account is the sign of a successful encounter with Jesus is you have to tell someone else. And so that's what she does. She goes into town, announces that she has seen this man, and he's told her these amazing things about herself. And again, she completely exaggerates. He told me everything I've ever done. I don't think he had that much time. But anyway, he is there, and so she tells the town to come and see whether this indeed might be the Messiah. Okay, so why don't we call it there, and and we'll pick it up there. There'll be no class next week. It's every 2 weeks.